For now, we are going to move on to our second speaker for the day, Anish. Anish Gawande is a writer, translator, and politician currently serving as the national spokesperson for the Nationalist Congress Party. A Rhodes Scholar, he holds degrees in comparative literature from Columbia University and in intellectual history and public policy from the University of Oxford. Anish is the founder of Pinklist India, the country's first archive of politicians supporting LGBTQ+ rights, and a recognized advocate for inclusion and equal rights. As a translator, he has got the poetry of Ramchandra Siras from Marathi to English. He continues to write and speak on contemporary art and literature while also curating exhibitions at prominent art galleries. Take it away, Anish.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you so much to everyone who has joined in on this Monday. Agatha, firstly, thank you so much for your presentation. I think many of the points you raised resonate so deeply with the work that I've been doing here in India and the experiences of so many activists, academics, and politicians in the country here today. I want to keep my talk today slightly brief, and I want to leave as much time open for questions as possible. But I want to focus on three essential aspects that draw upon my three roles. One as a politician, the second as an activist, and the third as just a citizen who's consuming content on the internet, right? So I started off my sort of work in politics when I was back in school. I was a door-to-door volunteer with the Indian National Congress, the primary opposition party in the country, and was knocking on people's doors in the 2014 election, which is when Prime Minister Narendra Modi was elected to power for the first time in India. I remember back then, we'd just seen the advent of Twitter, we'd just seen the advent of Instagram, and for the first time, the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, led by Prime Minister Modi, was using new digital mediums to target voters and to also drive public discourse. At that point, it remained an elite medium. I remember that this was a medium primarily used by politicians to engage with journalists. It was something that wasn't really well known or well used amongst voters in general. And when we were knocking on doors, most people still consume their content either through the 9 p.m. television news or through the newspapers that came to their house. Fast forward to a few years down the line, in 2019, which is when I came back from the US, where I was at university at Columbia, to run another election campaign for the Congress Party, this time in a more sort of enhanced capacity, running the press office for the party at the state level and then at the city level. I realized that things had changed fairly significantly. Twitter was still being used to communicate with journalists, but you also had Instagram becoming incredibly important, and you had YouTube becoming the most watched news website in India. Across the country, regardless of whether it was in rural areas or urban areas, people were turning to YouTube as a site for gaining their news, also forming their opinions and consuming a lot of content. Right? This is when we realized that Instagram was also important, that making videos was important, that reaching out directly to voters through social media platforms was an incredibly important way of being in touch with an electorate that didn't want to show up for rallies anymore, didn't want to show up for large public meetings. I think at that moment, it mattered how well you made your content. I think the amount of content you made did not matter as much. The dissemination was important. I don't think algorithms were working well enough for them to sort of ensure that a video meant for you reached you automatically. And so a lot of the work that went in at that moment in 2019 was primarily focused on dissemination networks being made powerful, and then fewer amounts of content and fewer pieces of content being created to reach the right people through WhatsApp in particular, which emerged as the number one political messaging tool in the 2019 election campaign, but also through other mediums. 5 years after that election, in 2024, last year, I took the plunge and joined politics as a politician. Initially in the Lok Sabha election campaign, I was running a media sort of outreach program for my party, the Nationalist Congress Party, Sharad Chandra Pawar, which is in alliance with the Congress party in my home state in Maharashtra and a part of the national opposition. And in my sort of role within the party at this moment, I realized three things very quickly. The first was that you did not need to focus so much on dissemination because platforms had taken over that job for you. You uploaded something onto an Instagram reel, and very quickly it reached the audiences that you thought it should reach, as long as the content was powerful enough. The second was that you were dealing with a incredibly large volume of content. It was not important to create fewer pieces of content that reach the right people, but rather to continuously create content that continuously ensured that you were being seen by people on their mobile phones. And finally, we realized that the length of this content had decreased significantly and substantially. And this primarily meant two things. One, it meant that complexity was often erased out of the discourse. It meant that we had a harder time countering misinformation and disinformation through more sort of nuanced rhetoric or logic. And it meant that a politics of polarization had finally found a medium that it required to be able to spread far and wide. In 2024, we saw vast amounts of disinformation in the election campaign, both propelled by state actors and non-state actors, and by individuals operating in individual capacities, right? And we recognize that the volume of disinformation that was spread over the course of that election was so large, and the amount of digital literacy across the country was so low that it became very easy to sort of churn out narratives in a way that we could not control. Now, in the months that followed, I became a spokesperson, a national spokesperson for the party, and my job was now to appear on 9 p.m. television debates. Very quickly, I realized that very few people were watching television, and more people were watching the clips that I sort of cut out of my television appearances and posted onto Instagram Reels. And very swiftly, I realized that I did not need to have a large social media team, nor did I need to produce high quality content, but I just needed to produce content regularly for people to take notice. Now, I say all of this and I sort of lay out this information architecture and its transformation over the course of the last 10 years for a very simple reason. I think for a very long time, we focused, particularly as activists and also as politicians, on being able to find the best argument against a piece of disinformation or a piece of misinformation. I think what we're confronting, particularly today, is that the number of arguments that are thrown at you are so large and so vast that we're struggling to find an effective way of countering them individually, which means that some sort of systemic solution needs to be found to the challenge of disinformation. The second reason I want to draw out this information architecture is because it deeply privileges those who have resources over those who don't. In a time and at a time when the number of pieces of content that you can produce and the ability you have to flood a platform with your content takes precedence over the quality of content you produce, you're left in a peculiar situation. Those with larger sort of teams, those with a higher spending capacity, can produce this content continuously and be seen by more people, and those who don't have that sort of ability, and not just through monetary resources, but also through time or skills or digital sort of prowess, are often left behind. And what this does lead to is a sort of preponderance of content from those spreading disinformation and a lack of ability of us to respond adequately because of a lack of resources. And finally, where that also leaves us is at the mercy of algorithms, but also of new technologies that make the creation of this content much easier than ever before. Just a couple of days ago, I was in a roundtable on AI and politics, and the discussion across the room was around how easy it has become to create clones. And these are not just deep fakes that serve sort of political propaganda purposes, but they're also sort of tools that allow you to create video content and arguments at an unprecedented pace. So on an issue that is becoming incredibly important, I can immediately sort of create 100 pieces of content that go out onto people's phones before they've even had a chance to speak to another human being or form an opinion independent of their sort of social media content consumption. Now, this isn't to say that people aren't forming these opinions independently, right? It's also not to say that very often these are uh, topics or debates or issues that are gaining political valence or political sort of importance through real life incidences. Of course, Trump's tariffs are making headlines, and the content that you produce is responding to the headlines created by government action. But very often, we've also realized that what gets to create headlines then is state action. So only when governments act and we're forced to listen does something become the news. Only when those in positions of power decide that this will be the news story for the day does that become the news story for the day. One, because you've seen a collapse of news media organizations and traditional media organizations, which, flawed as they were, still had a commitment to some sort of basic ethics and some sort of rules of reportage, but also because you've seen a complete fragmentation today of news cycles, but also news consumption patterns. I jokingly told someone the other day that, even 10 years ago, if I met somebody else at 11 a.m., both of us would know what the most important stories for that morning were by reading the front page of the Times of India. And that was generally accepted as the important stories for the day. Of course, individual stories within the paper might differ. The sort of stories you found in different newspapers might change. But the front page of the country's most important newspaper was always the sort of barometer for what counted as mainstream. That simply does not hold true anymore. If you switch on the 9 p.m. news debates in India today, every channel is reporting on a different story on most days, almost as if what is important to us differs upon the definition of us. Now, as an activist, this has given me both sleepless nights, but also allowed me to think creatively about these possibilities opened up by a sort of information compartmentalization that allows certain content to reach certain people and certain content not to reach other people. Funnily enough, and I can't back this up with empirical data, and so I'll rely upon those of you who do more work in research to sort of support this. But over the last year in particular, I've noticed that the amount of trolling one receives has reduced because the content one produces really reaches those who are trolling you. There's been a complete siloification of content where content rarely sort of goes beyond the boundaries of the echo chambers it's meant to exist within. It gets larger numbers, it gets more likes. But what I'm finding more than ever before is that it doesn't draw out the sort of anger or the sort of hate that you do see otherwise. Of course, when it does, the content does much better. But we've seen this strange sort of situation where your message is rarely going to those who might possibly be convinced by it, which brings about its own challenges of what that message can hold for communities that need to be convinced of a disinformation that needs to be dispelled, but also holds some solace in our dreams for an internet that sort of allows us to find a safe space that has been denied to us so long. I know I have to wrap up very soon. I see you back on screen, Chitra, so I'm going to keep this very short and wrap up by opening up to three questions that I'd love to discuss once everyone's finished talking. The first is around the volume of content that is generated today and how we counter it. The second is, and this was part of the video that I had, the doom scrolling that seems to have set into our timelines and this sort of politics of distraction that seems not geared at. And I know, Agatha, you spoke about how the anti homosexuality bill in Uganda has been portrayed as a distraction from other issues, but increasingly I'm finding myself worried that these distractions are just constant and one forgets what issues they're distracting from. and what we do with this sort of politics of distraction, and how do we learn how to recenter our focus on things that matter. And the third and final thing that I really want to consider is that how do we now, as activist communities, one, prevent this disinformation from affecting us, but how do we also creatively use this as a moment to find new avenues to gather, perhaps new avenues to meet on, or platforms to meet on, to dream of more imaginative futures. Thank you very, very much. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Anish. Thank you so much. I'm concerned that just my appearing on screen scared people into stopping. I feel like Big Brother, but thank you so much for that, and for that frankly chilling look into what the intersection of tech and politics looks like right now. And I think one of the points you raised about how one of the main strategies of misinformation and disinformation is a flood of content, like a deluge of content, which is, I think, very, very difficult to address, because that's where traditional techniques of things like fact checking completely fall apart, because it's impossible, really, for by any metric of reality, for anybody to fact check even a single percent of all the things that flash by on our screens, right? So this is where we have to. I love that you said that thinking outside of the box and being more imaginative with our solutions is key. And yeah, we would love to hear more about that during the Q&A. Thank you again.